Well, welcome everybody. Um, my name is Natasha Emerson, for those of you who may not know me, and I'm super excited to welcome Marla Lopez to this awesome Grand Rounds. Besides being my wonderful PCL intern this year, a little bit about Marla. So Marla Lopez completed her undergraduate education at the University of California, Irvine, graduating with a BA in psychology and social behavior. After working as a project coordinator in research, she attended the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she completed the majority of her doctoral training in clinical psychology, and where she specialized in working with children and families. She is currently completing her clinical internship with the Pediatric Consultation and Liaison Track at UCLA. I miss her dearly since she's finished her 8 months and she's now doing her thing on 4 West. Marla's clinical interests include supporting youth and families within medical settings, particularly youth facing the challenges of chronic illness, new diagnoses, or prolonged hospitalizations. As a Spanish speaker, Marla is also interested in providing services to Spanish-speaking families, particularly those living in underserved communities. Marla's research interests are broadly in children's health. Her work has borrowed from psychosocial and systems perspectives to examine the interactions between the individual and environmental level factors that influence children's health outcomes. Personally, she is the mother of a very cute, almost 3-year-old Claire, and she commutes from a long way. So I'm running out of great podcast recommendations for Marla. So if you have any juicy ones, you know who will benefit from them. Um, I'm thrilled that Marla is going to continue on to do a part research and clinical postdoc next year at Loma Linda, where she's going to continue being a strong advocate for underserved families in medical settings. So without further ado, I'm super excited to give it up to Marla, who will be giving us this wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much, Natasha, for that wonderful introduction. And yes, please send me all the podcasts that you find interesting my way. I'll go ahead and share my screen to begin to share the slides.
And I can see that was perfect. So go for it.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. As I think everyone already knows, I'll be presenting on preschool executive control and adolescent dietary outcomes. And here in this presentation, I'd like to specifically highlight the role of context and environmental factors. So before we get started, I just want to remind everyone of the main objectives. So first, I think an objective here is to increase understanding of the association between executive control, or EC, as I'll be calling it from now on, and health outcomes in youth. Second, we'd like to increase understanding of social ecological factors that play a role in the association between EC and diet. And third, we'll examine social economic status and food environments as potential moderators in the association between preschool and EC and adolescent dietary trajectories. All right, and before we fully launch in, I sort of want to cover some of the main themes that we'll be covering throughout the presentation. We'll first discuss diet as a key health behavior. We'll then get into what diet looks like in adolescents and why it's important to study it within this specific time frame. We'll talk about EC and health behaviors generally, and we'll cover really briefly the EC diet literature in both adults and adolescents. We'll then get into the potential role of the food environment and why that's an important moderator that needs to be studied. And we'll discuss what useful indicators of high-risk food environments might be. Lastly, we'll get into my dissertation, as this is sort of what my dissertation focuses on. And although I will not cover results as we recently wrapped those up, I will cover aims and methods, and I might hint at some of the result patterns that we discovered. And lastly, we'll go over implications and an overall summary. So my research interests really center on key health behaviors and factors that influence these behaviors in youth. Key health behaviors are sometimes termed high impact behaviors because we know that they have pretty important consequences for overall physical and mental health. So these behaviors generally include sleep, physical activity, and diet. And we know that these behaviors are formed and also transformed throughout early life, in childhood, and in adolescence. And when one of these pillars of health becomes compromised, we know it can compromise other health behaviors and have a detrimental impact on physical and mental health, as well as overall functioning. I will be covering diet mostly as one of the key health behaviors. And we know that diet tends to be pretty intertwined with obesity. In the past decade, the World Health Organization has called obesity one of the most important public health challenges of the 21st century. And according to most recent CDC statistics, we know that approximately 19% of children and adolescents meet criteria for obesity in the US. And we know that there are higher rates among Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black children. Obesity is linked with conditions such as high blood pressure, high cholesterol, type 2 diabetes, and breathing problems. So we know it's a big focus in the diet literature. However, I do want to note that although diet and obesity are deeply intertwined, obesity is more than just about diet, and diet is more than just about obesity. We know that healthy weight is also about the lifestyle of the individual and the societal factors that are implicated. And oftentimes the interventions that target healthy weight are trying to address other factors beyond diet. And we know that healthy eating is generally linked to lower risk for other serious health problems. So it's, like I mentioned earlier, a key health behavior that is more important to, that is important beyond just healthy weight. And so I will be really focusing on adolescence. And so I'd like to cover sort of some of the reasons why adolescence is a critical period. We know adolescence is a unique developmental phase. It's sort of characterized by increased autonomy and independence from caregivers. And so this means that adolescents are encountering really novel opportunities for making independent decisions about health. So some examples that sort of come to mind are how adolescents often go in by themselves to see primary care providers. They are spending more time with same-aged peers, going out to restaurants and making decisions about what they eat or what they don't eat. And they're also undergoing really important physiological and neurodevelopmental changes, which those can also impact what someone consumes. But I'd also like to point out that this phase is a phase for executive, when executive control is also sort of having a unique power. And so I'd like to cover that in detail a little bit later. Something that we know is that dietary trends are not necessarily stable across the lifespan, and they may actually undergo pretty important change in adolescence because of these reasons. So overall, diet in adolescence seems to be a pretty important research topic. Contextual factors also play a role in adolescents' dietary behaviors. And so here I'd like to draw from a socio-ecological model introduced by Mary Story and colleagues. And so we can think of the adolescent diet being influenced by three main levels of environmental factors. So at the very top, we have the broader macro system, which consists of the political and societal circumstances related to food access. Then these factors sort of trickle down to shape the more immediate or proximate contexts, which can have a more direct impact on dietary behaviors or dietary choices. So here at this level, we might consider the food trends, family characteristics, and the home environment, and how these come to impact dietary behaviors. At the individual level, we have personal level factors that contribute to dietary behaviors. So we might think about health status, eating practices, self-efficacy, genetic predispositions, or other food-related skills. And so overall, all these factors come together and contribute to shaping lifestyle and dietary behaviors. So diet in adolescence is not great. We know that adolescents do not consume recommended amounts of key food groups and nutrients, and often overconsume saturated fats and sugar. So diet can be measured in various ways, but a common indicator or outcome is the Healthy Eating Index, which stands for or it measures the extent to which individuals follow American dietary recommendations. So generally speaking, higher scores reflect better or just better dietary quality. The maximum score is 100. So you can sort of think about this as letter grades. And throughout the lifespan, we see that diet isn't great, but it's particularly bad in adolescence. However, we don't really know what's really happening within the adolescent period. But we do know that whatever happens in adolescence tends to have consequences for health in adulthood. So dietary patterns that seem to be established in adolescence appear to track into later life. And we know this would pose greater risk for obesity and other kinds of diseases. And as I mentioned, dietary trajectories seem to be understudied. We don't really know what's happening to the adolescent diet between ages 14 and 18, meaning that we lack longitudinal evidence within this time period. And the evidence that we do have is somewhat mixed. Some evidence indicates that adolescent diet is pretty stable, so it doesn't really change or undergo any periods of worsening or improvement. But there is some evidence suggesting that within adolescence, diet seems to worsen in quality. And trajectories are important across the lifespan because they can tell us when outcomes are beginning to worsen or stable, or when that is exactly happening. Executive control has emerged as an important predictor of obesity and non-homeostatic eating. Generally defined, we can think about executive control as a set of cognitive processes or abilities for directing behavior. And the literature states that there are three sort of main domains within executive control. So the first would be working memory, which refers to updating or manipulating mental information. The second is inhibitory control, which refers to regulating or redirecting responses. And the third is flexible shifting, which generally speaking is how you switch between tasks or rules. And we know that these three domains make up executive control, but executive control is important for higher level abilities, such as planning or reasoning. So EC appears to be a general predictor of various outcomes. We know that it's associated with school achievement, mental health, and physical health. And what is particularly interesting is that preschool EC shows longitudinal associations with the outcomes in later life. So just some of the research that we know about EC in preschool indicates that deficits in early preschool EC is associated with more internalizing symptoms in elementary school. We also see associations between poor deficits in preschool EC and poor academic outcomes by kinder. And related to physical health, we have seen research that indicates that deficits in preschool EC is linked to more weight problems by elementary school and more consumption of sugary foods. So why exactly is EC in preschool so important? Well, the literature does indicate that children at this age, so between ages 3 and 5, show marked improvement in EC performance. And this is sort of evidenced by an increased ability to process environmental cues. We also know that children at this age are better able to determine relevant steps for attaining goals, and they're also better able to change behavior according to circumstances. We also know that preschool is one of the first sensitive periods of EC development. So executive control has a protracted developmental course, meaning that how it presents in early life is not exactly how it, or may change as development continues. And we think that how EC begins to develop in preschool matters for how it develops in later life. We also know that EC structure changes over time. So this is sort of why the developmental perspective is important. EC is not a static construct, and research indicates that there is increasing differentiation of the three main abilities. So if we think about working memory, inhibitory control, and flexible shifting, these components all seem to load into one sort of factor as a latent variable if we're thinking about how we would statistically conceptualize this. And over time, it seems like those three abilities tend to separate a little bit more. And so the difficult thing about EC is that we have trouble conceptualizing it statistically across time. And there is sort of a rarity in longitudinal research. So there is some discrepancies in how studies will measure EC. And so this is something that I will touch on a little bit later. But if you take the EC literature, you will see that studies tend to measure it very differently. So some studies will focus on one component and only measure, say, working memory or inhibitory control. Some studies will take a couple of those, or some might even just say this is general EC and sort of think of one main construct. And yet others might decide to measure higher level abilities such as planning or organization. So this can create some challenges for interpreting research. I'll get into the associations between EC and diet, and I'll focus a little bit on adult frameworks. So the social neuroscientific model, which was proposed by Hall in 2016, highlights the transformation of the human food landscape in recent history, noting that the current overabundance of high-calorie foods that are both relatively easy to access and heavily advertised can have a big impact on how someone decides to pursue dietary choices. So we know that EC abilities, or at least how this framework posits this idea, is that EC abilities would have a pretty important role in food consumption. So if we take an example, we could see how inhibition is necessary to manage consumptive behaviors and food craving responses, particularly in an environment that has a lot of food stimuli or food-related stimuli. So I'll do a really quick snapshot of the EC and diet literature in adults. The framework that Hall proposed is supported by research indicating that upregulating stimulation of the prefrontal cortex is important, which is important to EC, is associated with reduced craving responses for high-calorie foods. However, we also see that EC may only be important in specific contexts. So findings from a paper by Hall and colleagues in 2015 suggested that individuals with poor EC may be more likely to overconsume high-calorie foods compared to individuals with stronger EC, but only if facilitating cues, such as motivating stimuli, So things like posters of fast food were present. In the absence of these motivating cues, individuals with weaker EC exhibited similar levels of self-control compared to stronger EC individuals. So this sort of really points to the idea that where a person is eating and what is present or what kind of food stimuli is present in the environment is important. And as we'll see a little bit later on, this is the kind of research that really informed my dissertation. There's quite a bit of research on the association between EC dietary intake in youth. However, that evidence is somewhat mixed, and that seems to be largely due to the methodological inconsistencies across studies. So as I mentioned, how EC is measured matters, but how dietary intake is measured also matters. So diet can be measured in many, many ways. So the HEI is a pretty important outcome. However, across studies, we will see differences. So you might see studies focusing only on amount of fats or sweets or vegetable or fruit intake. And so that also creates its own set of complications. What we do know from the literature within children and adolescents is that better working memory seems to be associated with healthier dietary intake, and deficits in general EC, when it's measured as general EC, are associated with less healthy dietary intake. But we'll get into some of the limitations of that research in a little bit more. The evidence that we do see seems to be consistent with some of the frameworks that have been proposed for youth and children. And this framework was actually proposed by my advisor, Tim Nelson, in a paper published in 2019. And generally speaking, this framework highlights how ongoing deficits in EC, so deficits that perhaps were present early in life, and appear to continue, can lead to problems in different forms of control, which can ultimately have an impact on dietary behaviors. So if we think about the types of control that are relevant to EC, we can think about attentional, behavioral, and emotional control. And so let's take a closer look at how some of those deficits can lead to the different kinds of dietary intake or behaviors. So it is theorized that impaired attentional control might lead to difficulties with directing attention away from tempting stimuli in the environment, which can then lead to more consumption of high-calorie food. If there is impaired behavioral control, that can lead to some difficulties in resisting or behaving in behaving in immediately gratifying ways, which can then lead to consumption of highly rewarding, although potentially unhealthy foods. And if there is impaired emotional control, an individual might have difficulties regulating emotions or using adaptive coping skills. And so that might lead to perhaps emotional eating and a pattern of less healthy eating. So if we think about the limitations of the extant research, we can think about a couple of things. So first, the literature has not distinguished between developmental stages. And so the research can't really differentiate how EC is impacting diet in, say, early childhood versus adolescence. And as I mentioned, there is a lack of longitudinal evidence. So we aren't sure if perhaps earlier forms of executive control are also important or relevant to dietary outcomes in later life. And as I have been stating, methodological differences across studies present challenges for interpreting the evidence. As I mentioned, conceptualizations of EC can vary, with some research focusing on specific EC components and others using more general constructs of EC. Dietary outcomes can also be measured in a variety of ways. And a lot of times dietary outcomes are studied at one time point, which offers a very limited snapshot of what diet is. And we think that generally speaking, multiple assessments can capture a more accurate measure of diet. And lastly, moderators of this association have been overlooked. And so we don't know if contextual factors can impact how this association plays out. So I'll get into what my dissertation proposed. My dissertation generally is about examining two critical periods and interactions with the environment. So these critical periods are EC in adolescence and dietary intake EC in preschool and dietary intake in adolescence. So the general question that we're asking here is preschool EC important to dietary trajectories in adolescence? And the second question that we want to ask is the obesogenic context a moderator? We can think about the term obesogenic as something that promotes obesity. However, I will also be referring to high-risk contexts where there is just more food stimuli present to not necessarily indicate that having more food stimuli is always going to be obesogenic. So if we can summarize the reasons why we want to put EC and diet in context, that would be because adolescence is a critical window for making health choices. And as adolescents are engaging in independent decision-making, they are perhaps relying on the abilities that are needed to respond or take action. But decision-making is always happening within a specific context. And so that really matters. You will see that one of the main hypotheses that I have is that strong EC may be especially important in higher risk contexts. So this kind of takes us to the question of how we may go about measuring contextual factors that interact with EC to influence dietary outcomes. So in other words, what are the indicators of an obesogenic or high-risk context? So we have sort of thought about two different categories. The first is SES, or social economic status, which we know can be a useful indicator of the resources necessary for food access, but also sort of points to the general environment. And so if we think about Mary's stories and colleagues, the framework that was proposed, we can sort of see that SES gets to the various aspects of the macro system, as well as the more proximate environment context and individual factors. The second category that we want to take a look at is the food environment. So this is the proximate environment where food is located, sourced, and consumed. And two specific contexts that we will be thinking about will be the home and the surrounding neighborhood. So let's think a little bit about socioeconomic status and what we know in the literature and the associations that have been uncovered with diet. We know that lower SES groups are more vulnerable to conditions associated with poorer dietary outcomes. We know that people from lower SES backgrounds tend to have less access to healthy foods, but there is also a higher density of fast food retailers and convenience stores. And so these types of retailers are sort of termed as negative in the literature. And so we believe that fast food and convenience stores generally promote less healthy eating. We also know that individuals from lower SES backgrounds have less resources to choose the healthier foods. So if you think about someone from a low SES community, they may be able to access healthier foods in a nearby community. However, getting there and being able to access those foods requires resources. Lower SES is also associated with higher risk for developing less healthy dietary behaviors generally. And so we think that EC may be more important for responding to the food-related stimuli. So if we're thinking about some predictions, and we'll get into hypotheses a little bit later, but if we're thinking about general predictions and where this is leading us, we're sort of thinking that lower levels of SES, EC may matter more. So strong EC may be required to navigate all the barriers present in lower SES environments and navigate the barriers that are present there to healthy eating. At higher less SES levels, it's likely that ECS may matter less. And that may be because healthy eating is better facilitated and there are fewer obstacles. I always like to make this note on SES because SES is a multifaceted construct. And so there are many things that go into SES. There is no one measure of SES. And across the research, I know we often encounter measures such as household income, parent education, or other less traditional measures such as parent occupation status or neighborhood risk. However, neurocognitive researchers have recommended that if we do study SES, we should utilize multiple and distinct measures and report on individual associations. Because what the association that may unfold between, say, household income and an outcome may not be the same that may unfold between, say, parent education and that same outcome. So here, as we talk about my dissertation, I'll point out how I am choosing to focus on income to needs ratio and parent education defined as the highest level completed in the home. So if we think about how home and the neighborhood environments influence diet, the literature states that eating locations differ in quality of food and the presence of food cues. And we know that more unhealthy eating tends to occur outside the home. Research also indicates that individuals who have closer proximity to fast food establishments also tend to have poorer dietary outcomes. So paralleling the predictions that we discuss with SES, we generally think that in high-risk food environments, EC again may matter more. And again, strong EC may be more necessary to override the tempting stimuli that are present and choose healthier food options. However, in lower risk food environments, it's likely that EC may matter less. And that would be because in these lower risk food environments, healthy eating may be more supported. And the EC abilities that we may tend to rely on when navigating tempting stimuli may just not be present. And so those abilities wouldn't be essential to making food choices. And so if I can broadly summarize the aims of my dissertation, I would describe it as the following. So I wanted to examine the association between preschool EC and dietary trajectories in adolescence, and I wanted to examine unique indicators of obesogenic or high-risk contexts as moderators. And so given that we sort of were thinking of two categories of indicators, we sort of thought about dividing it into two studies. So study one would focus on indices of SES, and study two would focus on the indicators of the food environment. The main contributions that these studies would offer would be that we would be employing a longitudinal approach, focusing on an important developmental stage for EC in a particularly important window for establishing dietary habits, which is adolescence. We would be relying on conceptualizations of EC supported by research. So in preschool, that would be a unitary structure. We are employing developmentally appropriate measures of EC and repeated measures of diet in adolescence. And we are focusing on interactions between EC and the environment using multiple and diverse indicators of high-risk environments. So our hypotheses were the following. We generally thought that weaker EC in preschool would be associated with poor dietary trajectories in adolescence. So we thought there would be a positive association between EC and diet, where if you have better EC, you generally have better diet, or if you have weaker EC, you have a poor dietary trajectory. At higher levels of risk, youth with weaker EC may show poorer dietary trajectories. However, those with stronger EC will show better outcomes. At lower levels of risk, we thought that youth may show better dietary trajectories regardless of preschool EC. And so that association between EC and diet may just be less strong in lower risk contexts, or may disappear entirely. So I'll get into participants and procedures. Our participants were a little over 300 children who completed a battery of 9 EC tasks in preschool. These kids were then followed throughout elementary school and into adolescence. And they then completed yearly dietary assessments from ages 14 to 18. At that time, parents also completed measures of SES, and they completed surveys on the food, surveys on the food environment in the home. And then we collected data in the neighborhood to measure the quality and enumeration of food resources within specific buffers for each participant. So I'll go over the measures in a little more detail. But here's a general summary. So for executive control, we had 9 tasks. As I mentioned, these were developmentally appropriate tasks that measured the 3 main domains of EC. So working memory, inhibitory control, and flexible shifting. Then dietary intake was measured using the ASA 24, which I'll get into in a little bit. But the main outcome that we were looking for was the healthy eating index. Then we measured the indicators of the obesogenic or high risk environment. Again, we really focused on SES and the general home and neighborhood environment. So this is, again, sort of summarizing the 3 domains of preschool EC that we measured. And these were computer administered developmentally appropriate tasks. So I actually was able to, I was trained and able to administer these tasks for the adolescents. And so throughout the lab sessions that we had with adolescents, we also asked them to complete an ASA 24 dietary recall, both in session and then after they left the session at home. So the ASA, as we call it, the ASA 24 stands for the Automated Self-Administered 24-Hour Dietary Assessment Tool. This tool was developed by the National Cancer Institute, and it is available online. So the way it works is the adolescents would create an account. They would have a password and a username. And once at home, they'd be able to complete a recall once we prompted them to. And so once they open that recall, it's about a 30-minute survey. They were asked to recall all the foods and drinks consumed on the previous day. And the reason it takes 30 minutes, it's because it's very detailed. So for example, if you report, say, consuming a burger, it would ask if there were any condiments added to it. And it would also ask if you had any drinks with it. And so if you think about how you know, all the different foods you consume, there are quite a few follow-up questions. So it's very detailed. And from the 2 assessments that adolescents completed, we calculated an overall HEI score. The food environment in the home was measured using the Comprehensive Food Environment Survey, or CHES for short. This is a measure of food in the home, physical activity, and media environment. This is a measure that parents completed. And the outcomes of interest were two scales. So the first scale is the fruit, vegetable, and juice availability scale. And so this scale lists a variety of veggies and fruits, and parents would indicate the availability of this food in the home. So this was rated on a scale from not at all present to generally present or very much present. And the fats and sweets availability scale was also administered in a very similar way. So this is where I think things get a little interesting, or I think this is kind of a novel way of measuring the food environment within the neighborhood. So here we use Geographic Information System, or GIS data, where we created base maps for a defined study area. So we really focused on a buffer around the adolescent's home. And those study areas were then assessed with food retailers classified by type based on definitions established by the Nutrition Environment Measures Survey for stores. So here we would take retailers and classify them into either fast food, fast casual, sit down, grocery stores, convenience stores, specialty food, or other. Then we had counts for each type of retailer obtained for each participant. The other interesting fact that I didn't note on this slide is that we also had research assistants perform what we called ground truthing procedures. So they would go out to the community, into the study areas, and basically confirm that the retailers were actually there and that they met these criteria for the certain type. So they would go out into the community and into the stores and make sure that we were assessing or categorizing these retailers correctly. Each count for each type of retailer was entered as a moderator in our analyses. So as you can see, a lot of models piled up. We also calculated an overall score for quality of the food environment. So here we focus on high risk, so measuring a general high risk using all the counts. So this would be a sum of basically all of these, excluding grocery stores, as this is the only positive retailer that has been identified. I hope I don't bore you too much with this, but I'll get into a little bit of the SEM, or structural equation modeling, that had to be part of my dissertation. Analyses were generally conducted using N+, and the MLR estimator, which adjusts for non-normality. And we followed three main steps. So first, we estimated HEI trajectories using latent growth modeling, or LGM. And so in doing that, what we're essentially doing is taking the assessments taken at each age, and sort of identifying if an intercept only model, adding slope, or a quadratic factor is the best fitting. Then we estimated EC as a latent variable, and then we finally introduced the moderator to account for the interaction. Here on the slide, you are seeing a rather simplified statistical conceptual model. And here you only see the intercept model. But as I will get into later, we actually found that the quadratic model was the best fitting one. And so generally speaking, all the EC tasks would load onto a single latent variable. And then we would perform the interaction with the contextual variable. But we ran into some hiccups in doing that due to the model burden. And so we ended up extracting factor scores. So that simplified things a little bit. But yes, there were a few headaches involved in getting this to launch. I'll also note that we used time scores to account for individually varying times of observation. So essentially, this means that we generally think about establishing 1 year intervals if we think about the dietary assessments and when they were conducted or when they were completed. However, what we found is that those intervals weren't as accurate because some adolescents came in before or a few months before, a certain birthday in adolescence, and so we wanted to account for that. That also created a higher model burden. So this is why we ended up using factor scores. But as I mentioned, when we compared the intercept only linear and quadratic models, we found that the quadratic model was actually the best fitting model, which is essentially saying that there is a slope that we can add starting at age 14. And we also can account for a curvilinear change. However, I will say that the slope and the quadratic factor were non-significant. So generally, trajectories of HEI scores are stable. In screening for potential covariates, we kept sex. We screened for BMI as well, but we found that BMI was not consistently associated with HEI scores in adolescents. So we only kept sex. In the environment, the food environment models, we did keep income to sort of account for the associations there. And then finally, we probed for significant interactions. So any interactions that were significant, we probed to determine at what level of the moderator was the effect significant. I want to say that the hypotheses that we initially proposed were rather optimistic. We were sort of thinking that EC would offer, some sort of protective factor for those who are in higher risk environments. However, I will say that as we analyzed the pattern of results, we were not finding that that was the case. And so as we think about how, we might interpret results that maybe indicate the opposite, that the association between EC and diet is only occurring in lower risk contexts, we might think about developmental cascade theories, which I know a quote that tends to go with that is competence begets competence. And so this would mean that earlier developmental success is important to success in other developmental domains. So deficits in EC may be associated with poor outcomes, or better EC may be associated with better outcomes regardless of context. We also want to think about psychobiological developmental models. So these models indicate that individuals must adapt to their environments, often at great costs. So in higher risk environments, we know that the factors there can place constraints on individuals' abilities, or perhaps favor the development of abilities that may be necessary to survival, but potentially detrimental to health. So if we think about lower SES and why that is actually associated with worse EC outcomes, we can think about how that may be more adaptive. So maybe careful planning or thinking is not as adaptive in lower SES environments as it would be in higher SES. And so maybe we can't think of EC as being as protective as expected. So I sort of want to just hint at some of the results without giving too much away. Hopefully those results will be published soon. As for potential implications, I sort of want to think about how if context is important and we know that certain associations only occur within specific contexts, then this can inform interventions. A lot of the EC and diet literature points to how targeting EC is important, but this may be insufficient if we find that this is only occurring within certain contexts. And so intervention may be most effective when both EC abilities are strengthened and risk in the environment is reduced. And what is also important about preschool EC is that we know that this is a sensitive period And sensitive periods are time frames in which development is impacted by both positive and negative environments. So EC can be improved as early as preschool, and there is evidence that interventions can be effective at this time. So here's an overall summary of this presentation. I hope we learned that key health behaviors are important to overall health and outcomes, that EC is a modifiable factor that is linked to dietary intake across youth, but research has not yet bridged important gaps in this literature, and longitudinal evidence is lacking and very much needed. And again, such associations may only unfold under specific contexts or for specific groups, which is important for informing targeted interventions. I will now stop sharing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marla. As you know, I spent some time in pediatric obesity clinic every week, and so this hit home in a variety of ways. I think one of the most interesting things that you mentioned at the end is the fact that kind of high EC may be maladaptive in kind of high risk contexts. And I just think about our kiddos who are growing up in unsafe environments in which being hypervigilant and impulsive and making decisions quickly, or having food and taking it in regardless of the quality of the food because you don't know where the next meal is coming from, how that may actually kind of favor the development of lower EC. So I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, agreed. And so this is why I stated that, the hypotheses that we generally had, while evidence-based, were rather optimistic, right? And I remember a discussion that I had with my advisor when he was like, like we are being really optimistic here. Let's hope that, the results are not the other way around. And actually what we are finding is that, the association is actually unfolding within less or contexts where there is less risk. So in higher risk contexts, EC actually isn't as influential.
Influential. Yeah, that's really interesting. I also, one of the other things that came up for me is obviously, a lot of times we see adolescents trying to address their obesity. And one of the things that I've thought about a lot with the pediatricians I work with is it sort of too late, right? By the time we get to adolescence, because it's just been years and years of these kind of patterns developing. And actually, one of the things that I know you didn't mention, but I wondered if you guys thought about is how sleep is kind of a covariate for all of these things. Because I see a lot of teenagers with bad eating habits that also have insomnia. And I'm also wondering if optimizing like sleep hygiene in those earlier periods can kind of protect EC. So I don't know if you guys thought about throwing sleep in as a factor. Obviously, that's also evolves over time, and there's different ways of measuring that. But
yeah, so sleep is one of those key health behaviors that we know is also foundational to health. And so if we think about like the three pillars being diet, sleep, physical activity, if one of those pillars falls, like all the others fall as well. And so I think that's a great question. There's actually quite a bit of research on sleep and EC, and I think there's actually like a bi-directional association, right? Where if you have poor sleep, you have poor EC. If you have poor EC, you may actually also have like less quality or worse sleep. So I agree that that's a wonderful question and something that needs to be studied.
yeah, I would imagine it's probably difficult in longitudinal models just because it's something that changes all the time, like whether you're 3, you're 7, you're 10.
So just needing like repeated assessments is definitely necessary. And actually, the lab where I come from, that's kind of what we try to do, longitudinal evidence for these key health behaviors across childhood and adolescence. So hopefully more comes from it.
Yeah, I'm excited to see the study. I have one last question, actually. I'm wondering, especially for our kind of child clinicians out there, what you think about ADHD within this context, because I know that that's another huge comorbidity that I run into in pediatric,
Mhm.
and whether there's any sort of evidence that screening, identifying, and treating ADHD may sort of mitigate some of those relationships of risk.
Yeah, I think so I think that there's an important thing there's an important question there. So are deficits in EC always ADHD?
Right.
And I mean maybe, right? But also maybe not, right? Like maybe you may have like really poor working memory and just have lower EC in general, but not necessarily meet criteria for ADHD. So I think that's an important question. But I think where I tend to land is, I'm less worried about the diagnosis and whether or not deficits in EC are present. So someone may not have ADHD, but may like really struggle with like just these really basic skills and abilities, and still have like, poor outcomes because of that. So something to think about.
Maybe screening for EC specifically as opposed to just
Just ADHD.
yes or no ADHD.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much. I know I'm going to be thinking about this a lot clinically, and I'm really excited to see the paper.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else has questions after the fact, feel free to email Marla
Of course.
and we'll get those answered. But thank you and great job.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Bye-bye.
Bye.